The U.S. economic outlook continues to show modest improvement, but while the manufacturing recovery is on track, caution flags remain for the overall economy, according to the latest Manufacturers Alliance MAPI quarterly economic forecast. Manufacturing production will outpace the overall economy and is expected to show 6.2% growth in 2011 and 4.2% growth in 2012. Manufacturing is expected to see a hiring increase, with the sector forecast to add 288,000 jobs in 2011 and 374,000 jobs in 2012. While this is good news when discussing the high unemployment rate, it highlights another persistent problem. Skilled workers, particularly younger skilled workers, aren't necessarily available to fill those positions, and it's a problem that may only get worse. Cliff Waldman, global economist for the Manufacturers Alliance and MAPI, and council director for the Manufacturing and Information Systems Management Councils, joins us today to discuss why there may be a shortage of skilled workers in manufacturing, particularly in the U.S. Hi, Cliff.
Hello, Janelle. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. So, what's going on with demographics?
Well, what motivated me to study and put together this analysis of U.S. and global demographic data is the persistent concern of U.S. manufacturers that there is a shortage of skilled manufacturing labor in the United States, a remarkable fact given the fact that we are suffering with 9% unemployment. It is a long-term trend, one that has been long-term in coming. Some of it is perception about the manufacturing sector. Some of it is the failure to influence our kids to go into engineering. But there are strong demographic forces at play that are also influencing the workforce situation, and I'd like to make your readers aware of it. In the first slide of my presentation, I show slowing global population growth. There are three lines here: the world, the less developed regions, which are Asia, Latin America, Africa; the more developed regions, the U.S., Canada, the Eurozone, UK, Japan. All of them are slowing in their population growth dramatically. Most notably is the more developed regions, which are quickly approaching that zero growth line. And the United Nations predicts that by mid-century, 2050, 2055, that the more developed regions might actually start to lose population. Why is this as important to the business world? But if you look at the next slide, I show the share of the world, of the more developed regions, and of the less developed regions that are in the age 15 to 64 cohort. Why is that important? That is a rough approximation of the workforce. And what we see is that the workforce share of the total population is leveling for the world, is leveling for the less developed regions, but is actually now starting to decline. We're right on the precipice of a decline in the share of the labor force in the total population for the more developed regions. Well, what about the U.S. in this rather daunting global picture? If you turn to the next slide, I compare the U.S. to some major countries, both in the developed and developing world, Germany, the UK, Japan, China, and India, on two key metrics that matter to the population situation. One is total fertility, that's average children per woman in the population, and net migration per thousand population. Generally speaking, I think the graph shows that the U.S., for the time being, has a relatively favorable demographic situation. Its total fertility is just above the 2.0 per woman line, 2.07 to be precise, but that is just a tad below what is known as the population replacement rate, which for most countries is something like 2.1 and 2.2. That's the rate of fertility growth where the population does not decline, where it stays even. We can afford to just be sitting on that line there because we have strong net migration. And for right now, our demographics are relatively competitive. But the U.S. is undergoing a parallel situation in terms of the aging of the population to the rest of the more developed world. If you turn the slide, I show the percent of the U.S. population in the aged 15 to 24 category and in the age 60 and over category. As you can see, those lines are going in a direction that we don't like to think about, but is very much reality. The 60-plus category is starting to move up. The 15 to 24 category is starting to move down. And as you go out in time, those projections make it clear that we are getting to be an older and older population. Why does that matter for the business world in the United States? Turn the page, and you'll see that a shrinking labor force share for the U.S. is not 5 years from now, is not 10 or 20 years from now, but is happening right now. We are right on the precipice where the U.S. population in the labor force cohort, the approximate 15 to 64 cohort, is about to shrink. And further, beyond the fact that it's going to shrink, let's look at its age composition. You turn the page. What I've done for the readers here is to calculate the share of the U.S. labor force in key age cohorts, two younger ones, 16 to 24 and 25 to 34, and two older ones, 45 to 54 and 55 and older. Look at the older ones. They are growing since the late 1980s in their share of the U.S. labor force. So those are sort of the demographic facts for the world and for the U.S. Let's overlay what this terrible recession that we're struggling to recover from did. If you turn the page, you can see that the Great Recession in the United States was not very friendly to the older age cohorts. This is the unemployment rate since 1970, really, of the two oldest age cohorts, of the 45 to 54 and the 55 and older cohort. Their unemployment rate went up well above the historical norms, above the 1970s recessions, above the 1980s recessions. And if the Great Recession was not only unfriendly to the older age groups, if you turn the page, you'll see that it was disproportionately unfriendly to the lower educated workers. On this graph, I show three lines. This is the unemployment rate of those with less than a high school education, of those who are high school graduates but have no college education, and those with a BA or higher. Naturally, even in good times, the less than high school cohort has the highest unemployment rate, the high school grad, no college, sort of in the middle, and the BA or higher at the lower end. You would expect that. But into this recession, the gap between them rose substantially, and now we are dealing with a situation where there is a 5% unemployment rate for those with the BA or higher. If that were for the case for the entire population, we would not have an unemployment problem. But the unemployment for those with less than a BA is at severely difficult levels, disproportionately difficult levels. Now, in the final slide, I sum all this up in terms of what it means for the workforce, for business, and for manufacturers. 4 points on this final slide, 4 takeaways here. First of all, the world population is getting older, clearly, and labor in general, those in that 15 to 64 cohort, is becoming more scarce. The U.S. is in good shape, at least has a competitive demographic profile now, decent, at least replacement rate fertility, and strong net migration, but the U.S. is experiencing a challenging age and labor force transformation. That's not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, but it's starting to happen right now. The Great Recession was especially difficult for the older and less educated workers in the U.S., and finally, the bottom line for those manufacturers who are struggling to sort of fill positions as we go further into this recovery, they're going to have to increasingly recruit older and less educated workers, and there are costs to that. Recruiting older workers has a health care cost associated with it. Recruiting less educated workers has a training cost associated with it. So while this problem of manufacturers finding an inadequate workforce in the United States is multi-tiered and multi-layered, the demographic dynamic of the world and the U.S. is a powerful one and is going to be felt in the hiring situations of manufacturers and really of the entire U.S. economy. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So with the population changes and the demographic changes, we already hear that people are working longer. Is that going to be necessary for the manufacturing world?
Well, it depends on whether or not it's possible. For management, probably yes. On the good note, the lifespan is certainly increasing. People want to work longer. 65 seems too young for a lot of people to retire. But as you go down the chain and you get to production workers, particularly in the heavier, more demanding industries, it's going to be hard to do that. It's hard to keep auto workers on past a certain age. Now, there is less of that. There's more highly specialized, highly technical labor that is doing less physically intensive work. But for those industries, that's difficult. But I would say for a broad swath of the higher tech industries and the management structure, yes, that might be desirable both in terms of labor and management.
Is there any good news about this shift?
Well, it's not a matter of good or bad news. There's a bit of good news. It may force companies, manufacturers and others, to really get a little bit more involved in training people to their specific needs, spending a little more money than they have on that, get involved with the educational system to sort of make their needs known. It may create a more proactive business community who will reach out to government institutions, who will work with labor, who will work with the educational system to help shape the workforce that will be needed in a demographically more challenging world. So I would say that's probably the silver lining, but it's not one that's going to come overnight.
Well, thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, my pleasure.